From the Dominion Post in Morgantown, West Virginia, this is the Postcast, the audio companion to the Dominion Post newspaper. In this episode, some local residents are in a self-imposed quarantine, a new marijuana ordinance moves forward in Morgantown, drag queens promote literacy, and we talk hunting again, this time in Alaska. I'm your host, Chris Schultz, and these are the week's top stories. On Wednesday evening, the Monongalia County Health Department issued a press release stating that no individuals in West Virginia have been diagnosed with coronavirus or are suspected of having the illness. Instead, 6 individuals, including 4 in Monongalia County, are currently undergoing self-quarantine after travel to China or interaction with people returning from China. I'm joined now in studio by Dominion Post reporter Ben Connolly. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
So, Ben, right off the bat, we want to be very clear for everyone listening that there are no confirmed cases of coronavirus in Morgantown and not even in the state.
That's right. There are no confirmed cases of coronavirus in West Virginia. There's not even any suspected cases of coronavirus or even folks exhibiting the specific symptoms of coronavirus.
Okay, but we do have 4 people locally and 6 people across the state that are currently in quarantine. So why are they in quarantine if they're not sick?
Well, first, it's important to note that they're in quarantine under their own discretion. This is kind of a self-imposed quarantine, and that's basically because they have either recently traveled back to West Virginia from China, or in one case, you have an employee of NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, who was manning a station in an international airport screening passengers who are arriving from China. And so kind of out of an abundance of caution, those folks have quarantined themselves for the necessary 14 days just to make sure that there are no symptoms, that they don't present with any kind of the respiratory symptoms that you see with the illness.
Is there anyone who is overseeing this? As you said, it's currently self-imposed, but once those 2 weeks are up, what is the procedure? Is there any procedure at this given time?
The Monongalia County Health Department, I believe, is involved with the folks who are local, just as far as confirming that they are not exhibiting symptoms. The other 2 cases are in Wheeling, and I'm not sure what the specifics are with those. I know according to the county's health officer, Dr. Lee Smith, he said those folks actually did travel back from the specific region in China where the virus is thought to have originated. So they may be under a little bit more scrutiny or a little bit closer examination, but I don't know that for sure.
And this information is coming to us from the Monongalia County Health Department. And to reiterate, there are no confirmed cases. This is simply a precautionary measure.
Right. There are no confirmed cases, or even, like I said, they're not even confirmed to have any symptoms of illness. They're just being cautious.
And we are all very grateful to them. Now, moving on, Ben, to your more regular beat, we do have some very interesting information coming out of the Morgantown City Council, which is they passed a new ordinance on first reading.
Right.
There's a little bit of the procedural complexity in there, but what can you tell us about this new ordinance?
All right, they passed it on first reading, which means it'll have to have a second reading to be adopted. But basically what this ordinance does is it provides the Morgantown Police Department with another option when it comes to running into somebody with 15 grams or less of marijuana. And this city ordinance will allow the police to basically levy a $15 fine with no possibility of jail time, and that'll go through the municipal court. So basically it'll give the city police the option of using state code or city code.
Now, in contrast, the city code is up to 90 days in prison or a fine of up to $1,000 or both, correct?
Right. That's the state code.
Right. And part of the wrinkle that this ordinance has created is that there are not 1, not 2, but 4 law enforcement organizations operating within Morgantown, and only one of those 4 would adhere to this ordinance. Can you tell us a little bit more about that issue?
Well, that's right. WVU Police, the Sheriff's Department, and the West Virginia State Police won't have an option to use city code, when it comes to arresting somebody for marijuana possession. They'll have to use state code, which, like you say, is far more strict than a $15 fine. That was one of the big arguments that people made against council taking this action. In particular, WVU came out strongly against it and said, you're going to set up confusion in students here who think that they're not going to walk away with drug charges if they've got less than 15 grams. when, WVU police will still be charging under state code, as will the sheriff and as will the state police.
Right. So that obviously raises this issue of, if you are further complicating this issue for the local population, why bring up this ordinance in the first place?
It was brought to council, I think, largely from the West Virginia chapter of the ACLU and the Working Families Party, and the argument that they made and the argument that council seems to have agreed with is that, the state kind of needs to move forward on this issue. We've kind of been languishing with this medical marijuana for a couple of years now. There's been no movement. And they feel like the state is falling farther and farther behind the rest of the country when it comes to kind of decriminalizing marijuana, which, as they pointed out, nationwide, those laws kind of disproportionately affect certain groups of people. The poor, minorities are more disproportionately affected by marijuana laws. And so they were asking council to kind of take the lead in maybe pushing the state forward on that.
Well, definitely very interesting stuff. And as it progresses through the council system, we obviously will keep you informed as Ben continues to report on that topic. And obviously, if there are any developments on the coronavirus issue, we will also defer to Ben on that topic. Ben, I want to thank you so much for taking the time for coming in here and speaking with me about these things.
Thanks for having me.
On the evening of Thursday, January 30th, the West Virginia University's LGBTQ+ Center presented Drag Queen Storytime and Show with local drag queens Robin Hart's Love and Demetria Blackwell at the Gluck Theater in the Mountain Lair. I'm joined now in studio by Dominion Post reporter Jim Bissett. Thank you so much for being here with me to discuss this story, Jim.
Hey, Chris. Thank you for having me.
So the Drag Queen Storytime, for the folks that are not familiar, can you explain to us what exactly this event was about?
What the Drag Queen Story Hour or Storytime is about, this started in San Francisco a few years ago. The idea is to have drag queens come out, read these stories of tolerance and empathy to children. It's got a sly marketing component to it because you have a segment of society that might be considered outsiders reading these stories of empowerment for kids who are trying to find their way as they're coming up in life.
Just to be clear, I'm not sure that this actual event is affiliated with the National Drag Queen Story Hour, but it's the same sentiment, as you said, stories of empowerment and making people who might feel other, showing them that there are people, in fact, that are like them in society.
Yeah, the same philosophy. Like you said, I don't think they are affiliated, but it doesn't seem like any of the events. There are events every day, drag queen story events every day across the country now. So, which may or may not be tied in with that official organization.
One of the messages for these events is literacy. What was read to the crowd there?
One of the titles, Stella Luna, was about a young bat who was having trouble trying to behave like a bat. This particular bat liked hanging out with birds as opposed to bats. But it turns out that it was in the end it was cool. She learns how to be a bat. The birds learn how to accept her for being a bat.
It's a nice little message there.
Yeah.
As anyone who's been following this story knows, this event was not met without controversy. Can you tell me a little bit about the concerns that were expressed by people in the community that were maybe not as thrilled as some of the event goers to see this happening in Morgantown?
We had a lot of comments on our Facebook page. Mm-hmm. To tell you really quickly, I didn't see any protesters at the actual event. The people that commented after the story was posted, I think a lot of them, it was just a matter of they didn't like the idea of this type of performer reading a story to their kids. Even though, the idea, hey, we're promoting literacy, they just didn't like what that entertainment is, what drag queens do as a rule. They just didn't like the idea of them stepping down and reading to their children.
Right, and now, as we mentioned earlier, this event took place on WVU's campus in the Gluck Theater. There had been a previous event that had been scheduled for November at the Morgantown Public Library on Spruce Street, and that event unfortunately had to be canceled. Speaking on the pushback that both of these events have received, can you fill us in a little bit about what happened in November?
You were one of the reporters on this story as well. There are a lot of backlash from the community. A lot of people saying, "Hey, I don't want a drag queen being anywhere near my kid." There were threats of physical violence to the two performers involved. It was completely different, though, at the event last week at WVU.
And do you think that the location of the event being at WVU versus at a public library had anything to do with the lack of presence that you saw?
I think it had everything to do with it, because I know we had talked about this briefly before. College campuses are they're insulated places. I mean, you have all the divergent voices coming in. You might have a controversial speaker come in at a forum or a class. You might have, like, an art major, for example, be a little provocative in whatever the senior exhibit is. But basically, college campuses, it's like I said, it's insulated. You can be who you are for 4 years or 7 years or whatever. So I think it had everything to do with the fact that it was university sanctioned and not part of a citywide event.
Well, we're obviously very glad to hear that the event went off without any issues. Jim, you had an opportunity briefly before the show to speak with the performers. Did you get the indication that this is something that they would like to repeat in the future?
They definitely want to do this. In fact, this is sort of the live component of a YouTube channel they have, where they go on every week, they post videos, and they read children's stories. They're seasoned performers. They were really effective reaching out to the audience. I mean, they got laughs. Kids loved them. They seemed to really enjoy what they were doing. In the end, they didn't break character one time. It was interesting watching them to see if there was going to be like a kind of break the fourth wall, like a knowing look to the audience or any kind of an innuendo, for the adults in the room. And they didn't break character once. It was about promoting literacy, promoting these stories of tolerance and empathy, and just saying, if you're on the receiving end of bullying, you don't have to take it. Tell your parents, tell your caregivers. If you're the person doing the bullying, maybe you want to think that the person you think is the most different just might be the person who ends up being the best friend you ever had.
Well, that's an important message even for some of our adult listeners. Jim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in and speak with us about this story.
Well, Chris, thank you for having me.
Finally today, we venture outside of West Virginia as we continue our conversation with sports reporter Andrew Spellman about his ongoing series on outdoorsmanship. I'm joined now in studio by Dominion Post sports reporter Andrew Spellman. Andrew, thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thanks for having me back.
Now, Andrew, this Alaska story of yours really attracted a lot of attention. Really interesting stuff in here. Can you tell me what attracted you to this topic in the first place?
Well, I met Josh a couple of years ago, and he kind of just talked to me about what he was doing up in Alaska, and I thought it was interesting. Kind of put it in the back of my mind for a while, just saw his pictures on Facebook, and then I started an outdoors blog right before I started working here and thought it'd be a really good story for that. But seeing the, traction that we've been getting here at the Dominion Post, I decided that it would be a good story to publish here.
Well, and we're glad that you did. Something that I'm very curious about as a non-hunter, West Virginia, as we discussed last week when you were on the show, is very rich in hunting, very rich in hunting culture. Plenty of opportunities here in the state, specifically where you're from and where Josh is from in Ritchie County. What is the appeal then to go all the way across the continent to Alaska, pay all that money to do what you could essentially do in your backyard?
You kind of hit on it there about West Virginia. Historically speaking, Ritchie County is one of the better counties for deer hunting. So I think the drive to Alaska here for Josh it's the last frontier. He wanted to do something with his degree in wildlife management, and you don't see the animals in Alaska that you see here. We don't have grizzlies, we don't have muskox or anything like that. So him going out there is just a new journey. It's a step in his hunting life. He's been hunting West Virginia, Ohio for his whole life and wanted to take that extra step. And, for other people, I'm sure there's a little bit of mysticism because you're really going out back to your roots. As a human hunter, you're catching your own fish, you're camping, and then eventually you're getting the animals. So you're putting in all the hard work for a big reward. And I think that is what the drive is for hunters leaving not just West Virginia, but the lower 48 to go up to Alaska.
Now, something that really interests me, again, as a non-hunter, is how do you even get to the level that Josh is at? He is now not only a hunter, but basically what you would consider a professional. He's a guide. How do you go from hunting on your family property to spending weeks at a time out in the bush with no support? How do you go from doing that to taking other people and being responsible for them and leading them on these types of hunts?
So for Josh, when he was getting his degree from Hawking Technical, he took some ranger classes and learned the necessary skills needed to guide people, even though that wasn't on his mind at the time. Most people have to go through a guiding school. The example he gave me, the school that he called first only took 2 people, but then found out with his credentials he could go straight into his apprenticeship, which was about a 2-year process. There's definitely a learning process to it. You can't just say, well, I'm going to be a guide, and then go up and, hand in an application to an outfitter. That's a very, very long process because you do have to learn how to keep people alive. Basic taxidermy, because you're out there for 21 days, sometimes maybe longer, and you have to know how to bone out an animal and take the hood off if they want to keep it. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Now, you ended your story very briefly with the discussion of a frustration that Josh has or an issue that he perceives in the hunting community. He talks about this, what we would call in other communities, gatekeeping around hunting. What can you tell me about that and what he told you?
Josh's main point was that hunting is becoming over-commercialized, and he was very transparent with me. He's sponsored by a couple of different places, but he's also not telling people, well, you have to use this if you want to get this. And that's the biggest thing. I could take you hunting, you being a non-hunter, and I could get you a 6-point buck on my brother's property, and you could be super happy, and then share it with somebody, but because they don't kill 6 points, they could completely ruin your experience by saying, well, you should have let that grow up. But the fact of the matter is, if you're not killing 4-point and 6-point bucks all the time, you're not doing anything wrong. He said that the reason we're seeing a lack of hunters is because, number one, things are over-commercialized, which means, I might not have the money to go out and buy a brand new $1,000 rifle and all this wonderful camo, when really all I can do is, buy some cheap camo, take my grandpa's shotgun with a slug in it, and get a buck. And then he hit on the fact that people are just ruining it, like in Facebook groups. People are ruining the experience for others by saying that they did something wrong when they didn't. So there's a lot of problems, but I do honestly believe that's another one too. I completely agreed with him about that.
Now, really briefly, this much larger project that you're embarking on to report on grouse population, and obviously grouse hunting in West Virginia, you just released the first article in that series. Something that you touched upon in that piece is the conflict between, I guess, what at this point is now traditional ideas of conservation, keeping a forest pristine, and this newer idea coming in saying that we need to take more decisive action, which includes logging, clear cutting, and even burning in some spaces to ensure that we're maintaining the habitats for these animals. What can you tell us about that very briefly?
80% of West Virginia is mature forest. And a while ago, the DNR was really hammering that we have to stop logging certain areas. Clear cuts are bad, but in reality, it's a cyclical process. So what they should have taught instead of full stop is we need to stop right now, but we need to be responsible about it whenever these forests regenerate. Because of this mindset, we have now come to a point where it's hurting animals, especially grouse. The biggest problem we're seeing is this lack of habitat, and then healthy habitat for the younger birds. It might be good habitat for the older ones in certain situations, but if you can't, get a good young population, why are we even talking about the older population? Prescribed burning and logging isn't bad. It's really good for forest regeneration, and it's just this callous on our brains as of late that all this is bad. And now that we're stuck in this mindset, we need to, really push ourselves to be like, if we're conservation minded, we do need to cut out these trees.
So really interesting and complex conversation going on here about land stewardship. Andrew, you're going to have a lot more on this topic coming up shortly. So I want to thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to your future reporting on the topic.
No problem. Can I do a little plug real quick?
Go ahead.
So I'm going out to Mineral Wells on Monday to video this guy and walk around with him and talk to him a little bit. Started hunting grouse about 3 years ago. Has not had a lot of success, so it's going to be fun to see what he has to say about it and what I learned from him. And that should be coming out in the next 2 weeks or so.
All right. Well, we look forward to it. Again, thank you so much for being here in the studio with us today.
No problem. Thank you.
And you can hear Andrew every other week on his own podcast, Best of Seven, where he and sports editor Sean Manning explore all things sports in our area. Be sure to also check out the Dominion Post's other podcast, All About History, exploring Morgantown and North Central West Virginia's fascinating past. That's all for this week's episode of the Postcast. The links to all the stories we discussed are in the description of this episode on your podcasting app. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Postcast by subscribing on your preferred podcasting platform. We would also really appreciate it if you took the time to rate and review the show. We want to hear from you. If you want to get into contact with me, you can email podcast@dominionpost.com, or you can reach out on any of the Dominion Post's social media. We are at Dominion Post WV on Twitter, at Dominion Post_WV on Instagram, and on Facebook, you can find us at facebook.com/Dominion Post WV. You can also tweet directly at me at Schultz Reports. That's SCHULZ. Thank you so much for listening. See you back here next week.